Hello, I'm Pastor Nanette Christofferson, and along with Pastor Steve Talmadge and our intern pastor Kevin Anderson, we are in our last Sunday of Epiphany before we roll into the Transfiguration Sunday and into Lent. And we find ourselves in Luke chapter 6, 27 to 28. And I'm using a commentary by Sarah Henrik this time. And Luke 27 to 38 is the exact continuation on from last week's Sermon on the Plain, but this is the Sermon on the Plain continued on as Jesus continues to bring to us ways of life that lead to life. So let's go ahead and get started. As we look to Jesus' Sermon on the Plain, these verses continue Jesus' teaching that put us hearers on a level plane or a playing field with all those to whom Jesus once spoke, the 12, the crowd of the disciples, and the multitude from all over the area. We get to hear Jesus open such a different worldview from our own that can leave us gasping. After the blessings and woes of the Beatitudes put those same purposes in memorable form, Jesus issues a call to take notice. In verse 20, he speaks to his disciples, a larger group than the 12, but including them. Our passage begins with a slight shift in the audience description. In 6:27, Jesus begins, I declare to you who are listening. Then he begins to describe the way in which those covenantal relationships with God are called to live. So let's take a look at Luke 6:27 to 38. But I say to you that listen, love your enemies, do good to those who hate you, bless those who curse you, pray for those who abuse you. If anyone strikes you on the cheek, offer the other also. And from anyone who takes away your coat, do not withhold even your shirt. Give to everyone who begs from you. And if anyone takes away your goods, do not ask for them. Do to others as you would have them do to you. If you love those who love you, what credit is that to you? For even sinners love those who love them. If you do good to those who do good to you, what credit is that to you? For even sinners do the same. If you lend to those from whom you hope to receive, what credit is that to you? Even sinners lend to sinners to receive as much again. But love your enemies, do good, and lend. Expect nothing in return. Your reward will be great, and your children of the Most High, for he is kind to the ungrateful and the wicked. Be merciful, just as your Father is merciful. Do not judge, and you will not be judged. Do not condemn, and you will not be condemned. Forgive, and you will be forgiven. Give, and it will be given to you. A good measure, pressed down, shaken together, running over, will be put into your lap. For the measure you give will be the measure you get back. All that power that flows from Jesus is dedicated to and will bring about a different world, God's world. The power will level the playing field no matter what rules we have established to create and protect our positions. The thriving of all creatures in God's realm requires a different ethos from those customarily in place. Jesus quickly lists a bunch of plural imperatives that describe behavior for those still listening. The very first imperative, love, is followed by some quite concrete examples. Do good. Don't just think well of, but do good too. Pray for, bless, give, do. This is a constructive ethos of behavior that will be summed up in verse 36, which is the basis for the examples Jesus puts forward, sums them up, and is itself a touchstone for questions about how to live in God's realm. Those who follow Jesus are to live as God lives, mercifully and generous beyond expectation, beyond comprehension. The norm for the world is what sinners do very well indeed. They love, lend, and do good. In our own day, it would be a joy if even the way of sinners was broadly lived out. But for disciples, for God's people, loving, lending, and doing good are all about generosity that does not draw boundaries based on the recipient's responses. It is good to keep in mind that love in this passage is about willing the good for another and acting on that will. The golden rule is insufficient for those in covenant relationship with children of, in verse 35, God. One's own wishes for oneself are no measure for one's treatment of others. Rather, God's mercy is to be the measure for God's people's behavior. In Mary's song, God is twice identified as merciful, and Zacharias likewise. That mercy, a sign of God's fidelity to God's promises, creates a people who might serve God without fear, in holiness and righteousness. All gifts flow from God's tender mercy and fidelity to promises made. In Luke 6, we see that generous healing, restoration, and hope flow through Jesus. Jesus makes sure we who are listening know that it is our calling as well. God's power is present, a promise that the realm of God is no chimera or fantasy, but that it is being lived out on a level playing field indeed, a leveling playing field in the world of Jesus. This longing for relationship is not something unique to the ancient world. Longing for a faithful relationship where promises are kept and roots can go deep, a relationship that can be healing and produce joy, is not something we can regulate to the past. Jesus' words to those who continue to listen, who give heed, in that old-fashioned phrase, promise that we have a part in that relationship too. We are called to live in God's realm, in accord with God's character, and the power is there for us to do it, to be caught up, to be healed, to lose the hostile aspects that hold us captive, to receive and to live mercy. As we wrap up Jesus' Sermon on the Plain, how do you hear Jesus? Do you hear Jesus as scolding or with a raised voice? Do you hear Jesus saying these things in a loving way? Perhaps, how do you perceive this teaching? Is it just an ideal, or is it a way of life? In other words, as disciples of Christ, we are called to live into these teachings as well as we can. And we may not. But when we don't, we are missing out on showing other people the very kingdom of God. Well, I hope you guys have a wonderful week this week, whoever might be listening. And I hope that you have some time to take a look at all of the Sermon on the Plain, starting back at verse 17 through our reading today. Blessings on your week.